Okay, we'll go a4. Oh my god, Alexander, we got a hype train. There we go. You guys want to bribe me, I see. This is the first time that we're facing, I think, anything other than e5. In the 5-minute speedrun, we faced this actually quite a few times, and so I outlined some of the ways we can play against this. And my favorite setup here for white, well, first of all, let's get this developing move out of the way, is the sort of English attack idea. Now, you can play knight f3, you can develop normally. Okay, so e6 is a different setup. e6 is the hippo, I think, or whatever it's called. Not the hippo. It's this weird setup where the knight comes out to e7. And this I would recommend that you tackle immediately. Ferocious gesture. Now, if you think about it positionally, the problem with the move e6 is that it creates a ton of dark square weaknesses around the king side. And when a complex of weaknesses is created in this way, oftentimes the way to exploit it is by opening up the position, creating more points of tension. And the way to do that, and this is a move which everybody has seen, you've seen me play it too in many of these positions, that is the early h4. Now, I'm not asking you guys to find this move because it requires a good amount of experience in this position to understand why h4 is good. Okay, so he goes d5. Now, e5 would close down the center, and there's no need to close down the center given that he's got all these weak squares. So how should we respond to this? If we don't want to close down the center, we don't want to take, and we don't want to open up his bishop, that would be foolish. And I will explain more in depth after the game, because these things can be a little bit hard to formulate. Knight f3 is correct. Also, for your information, so the abbreviation for knight is actually n. And the abbreviation for king is k. That's just the convention. And now we go h5. And now you guys should begin to see why this is actually so good. There's actually two main ideas to the move h5. The first is mostly in the event that he castles. We reserve the right to take on g6 and open up the h file and checkmate him. Now, in the event that he doesn't castle, and let's take back, we have cooked up a massive, massive threat, which is what? And particularly, he set the table for this threat. Let's hope that we have a chance to deliver this. And that threat is, well, what were we threatening here? Dark squares, dark squares, dark squares. We know that this is the main weak dark square. Boom. Bishop goes back. Checkmate. 400, thank you. Now, what's the first thing that we do? The first thing that we do is we notice that the knight is attacked, so we need to move the knight, right? No, we ask the same Shanklin question. What happens if I do it anyway? And this is obviously very simple. We go h6 anyway, counterattacking the bishop. His position just is completely in ruins. But I'm, 500 bits, I'm Ishkibu, and we got level 2. Holy smokes. Ooh, and now this is not mate. Oh, man, but we're going to have something very nice here. We're going to have something really nice here. Let me think, actually, for a second. Okay. We got 4 minutes to mate him until the server resets. So, the obvious move is bishop g5 defending the knight, but we don't need to do that. We don't need to do that. We can actually go knight e5 immediately, luring his king to f6. And the reason I go for this so confidently is that his king has no squares. This isn't purely, I don't know how to put this other than that this is intuitive. This is completely intuitive. And now here's the bamboo stick move. And I've told this to you before, you got a situation where the king is out of squares. You need to look at them. From which squares can you deliver checkmate? That is the key question. That's how you should formulate this. And if you think about it that way, there's really only one square. That square is g5. If g5 were to be protected, then bishop g5 would be made. So we don't need to go queen h5. We don't need to sacrifice. Try to set up an idea where you prepare to get a piece to g5. Yes, queen d2, and this looks ugly. This looks like that's all you're gonna do. But in a sense, I think that's a very elegant move. You're just building a battery and slamming the queen onto g5, and that is checkmate. And I actually think that's the best move. I'm not sure. The alternative method would have been to actually give a check anyway. Lure the king to g5. Now we're 2 pieces down, but now we can collect the queen. That would also be completely winning, although not checkmate. Simple and strong. So that's the danger of playing these kinds of openings. You know, when they're properly met, they weaken a lot of squares. So h4, right? Now, a lot of people had their heads in the right place. Some people suggested e5. I like that you guys were thinking about this move because it's, you know, you're trying to secure your control over the square, but this is premature because white is also not developed. And what can black do in a position like this? What can black do to contest white's control now of these squares? All right. g6 is right. Yeah. Or c5. But c5 is not good because it weakens... Whoa, look at this square. Remember what I always say about playing e6 and g6 in the Sicilian? That's the same effect. You want to go d6 here. Here you want to get rid of this pawn. Yeah, like white can play f4, but then the bishop can't really develop. Black can go knight e7. Black is okay here. So for that reason, we're going from the side of the board h4. And this is what I would categorize as a provocative move, okay? This is definitely a provocative move. And a provocative move isn't like a daring move necessarily in the context of chess. It's a move that tries to provoke weaknesses in one of several ways. No matter what black does, if black plays h5, then what square does this weaken and what can occupy that square? No, it's not really theory. I mean, what our opponent played isn't really a theoretical line. Yeah, bishop g5, look at that beautiful stronghold. And now you can play e5 and knight e4, and that's quite a bit stronger. If he plays h6, then there's a very common idea here where you go h5, g5, and now f4, blasting open the king side. You'll see this all the time in these types of positions. This is also bad. Our opponent decided to allow it after knight f3, knight e7. And now the double idea of going h6 and hg is simply devastating. Black just isn't able to contain all of the weaknesses in his position. All right. What if f6? Oh, but now look at these squares. Now we just drop the bishop back. Now we just drop the bishop back, and we can play bishop d3 and then later e5. This is a really, really good... I mean, this is basically winning positionally. All right. So this pawn on h5 can do 2 things. It can go to h6, dislodging the bishop from g7, and in an eventual attempt to get, let's say, a knight to f6 or a bishop to f6. Alternatively, in the event that black castles, we can play hg and open the h file and try to checkmate him down that file. All right, so de, knight e4, f5, h6, counterattacking the bishop. Boom, boom, and queen d2 is the absolute crusher. And that is the best move. In fact, that is the only move that wins in a clear-cut fashion. I just checked the computer. The only one. Because there's simply no stopping queen g5. With checkmate, he can stave it off with this. That does not help, because now bishop g5 is the mate threat. Okay? How should black react to h4? Well, I guess the lesser evil is probably to go h5. I think that this is probably the lesser evil. Although this kind of position is incredibly nasty, it's still pretty much defensible and quite solid. After our opponent allowed h5, I think he's essentially losing there. And yes, I would go so far as to say losing. 11:58, playing caught 0:50, cat. And let's go to Karo. So, yeah, so we've been encountering this line at several junctures in our early speedrun career. There's several ways that we can tackle this. Sort of the Karo-Khan way to do this is to do what? What's the Karo-Khan response to e5? So the Karo-Khan move is bishop f5. Now the funny thing is, and he probably doesn't intend this, but in response to bishop f5, there's a very nasty move, knight to d4. And I'll talk about this after the game. So it's worth switching up the move order here a little bit in order to stop him from playing knight d4 by making a move that we often also make on the Karo-Khan, obviously, which is c5. I'll talk a little bit more about the details, but trust me, knight d4 is the super nasty idea that he may or may not know. Bishop b5 check. So not a dangerous move. We can cover this check in a variety of ways. There's no reason not to play knight c6. Let's develop normally. He's probably going to take it. A lot of people at this level still fall in love with doubled pawns, but you know my position on these kinds of pawn structure deficiencies. We save a tempo. He moves his bishop twice, and I like the two bishops. I like the fact that his pawn on e5 is weak. I'm not worried about bishop takes c6 in the slightest. In the slightest. Okay, knight c3. So in what order shall we develop our pieces? So e6 is fine, but that would block in the bishop on c8. So we turn to the bishop on c8. Where should we put it? Where should we put it? So bishop f5 is, of course, still possible, but you have to be very flexible when it comes to development, and always consider if there might not be something better that usually doesn't exist. If you look at that here, you'll notice that bishop g4 exists, and I think bishop g4 is quite a bit more active. Bishop h5, keeping the pin alive, g4, bishop g6, and he goes d4. So he's created a lot of weaknesses on his king side, and now he plays d4. He's not playing this badly, and he's hoping for c takes d4, because then he will play knight takes d4, and he'll pile up on the knight on c6. How should we respond to d4? How should we respond to d4? What's up, Min? Yeah, just e6. e6 is like, again, super typical Karo-Khan move. Preparing to recapture with the bishop trading on our own terms. Bishop g5, not dangerous. Now the knee-jerk reaction, I think, for most people is probably to go bishop e7 here. But I think there's a better move. Aw, thank you, man. I think there's a better move. And some of you are noticing that better move is queen b6. I mean, it's just very nasty. Because we're applying pressure on the pawn, we're applying pressure on the bishop. We're not attacking either, actually. But there's a sense in which white's position is kind of close already to collapsing. And, ooh. Okay, we have, you guys ready for a somewhat risky, but somewhat five-head move. So the moment that he played g4, out of the corner of my eye, I made a mental note to myself to check this move. And, well, first of all, I'll give you guys a chance to find this move. Because what did I notice when he played g4? What I noticed is that this knight on f3 no longer has a defender. Not only does this knight no longer have a defender, but the pawn on d4 is also very poorly defended. It would be very nice if white had a pawn on c3, as he usually does in these situations. Now, you might be looking at this and saying, wait a second, I have three attackers. There's only two defenders. Why can't I just take on d4? Of course, the complicating factor is the pin. Now, what we can try to do is play bishop e4, attacking the knight, and if he takes the bishop, I take with the pawn. The knight is dislodged. This bishop is also going to be undefended if he takes my bishop on e4. And in order to deal with this successfully, okay, so queen e3. Now, that defends the knight, but it doesn't solve the underlying issue. Why did we play bishop e4? Not just to win this knight, but also to... Wait, actually, we have something better. Wait a minute, I was going to take the knight. But now that I look at this a little bit more carefully, what can we do here? Yeah, fork. But that's a bit of a misleading notion, right? Because the point of this isn't that it's a fork. He can still play knight takes d4 as he could before. But here, there's a rook on h1 that hangs. That line is more complicated than it looks, and we'll talk about it after the game. But the bottom, yeah, exactly, man. But I had an idea there, a6, so we'll talk about it. Now he's panicked and gone queen to d2. Now, which of these two knights should we take? And we can actually take either, that's the funny thing. But if you wanted to play this sort of more, in the most, let's just say, precise manner, okay, he just resigns. Because we can take either knight. We would take the knight on f3. I would take the knight on f3. Although we could take the knight on c3, because after bishop c6, bc, queen takes c3, defends the knight, boom goes the dynamite, that pins the queen. Thank you, Slunt. Okay. So, yeah. So here, bishop f5 is possible, but I was a little bit fearful of this move. And if you drop your bishop back, and now that I'm checking with the computer, this is actually good for black, but I misremembered this. But what move do you think that I was afraid of here from white's perspective? Yeah. I don't like allowing a move like this, e6, right? h4 is never dangerous. h4 is always possible, but h4 can always be met with h6. The move that I never like to face is e6, because this pawn is sort of very radioactive, and I mean, white wants to take on f7 and weaken black's king side. And if you take on e6, then this knight jumps to e6, then it can take on f8, and black loses castling rights. But the reason that this is actually not dangerous, and computers are a lot better at this than humans. Computers are very good at ignoring stuff. Humans are very bad, typically, at ignoring stuff. And so the computer's recommendation here is to pretend that nothing's happening and to simply go knight f6. And that is very, very instructive, because here's what the computer is saying. Well, it's not saying anything. What it's essentially saying is after e takes f7, bishop takes f7, it is true that black's king side has been damaged a little bit. It is also true that white has not developed any of his pieces other than his knight. This knight is susceptible to the move e5 with tempo. In addition, if you've watched my white games, you'll know that the opening of the f-file can actually be good for black in the long run when black castles. So this notion of not doing anything, ignoring almost what seems to be the threat, is very instructive, because there actually is no threat. There's an illusion of a threat, but there is no threat. And just developing normally is often the solution to these things. Okay. Yeah, so instead we decided to go c5. Bishop b5 check. What if white doesn't go f7? Well, how do you propose white play? And if white develops his bishop, for example, then I could essentially go queen d6 and compel him now to take on f7 in kind of a soft manner without doing anything crazy. And then go bishop f7 and then go e5, etc. All right. So c5, bishop b5, knight c6, knight c3, which is fine, bishop g4. And here I think that he played fine. h3 is good, g4 is good. And here he missed, I think, a chance to get an advantage. And funnily enough, in an effort to prevent e6, I have actually allowed him to play e6 in a much better version. The move e6 gives white a very big initiative. This is super instructive. The point of e6 is completely different than why it was made earlier. So here, the point of e6 is not necessarily to ruin white's king side. It's a positional pawn sacrifice. What do you gain in return for this pawn sacrifice, other than the obvious fact that black has doubled pawns? Who can explain that to me, and who can tell me white's next move? Yeah. So first of all, this is super nasty. Second of all, look at this bishop. It's completely stuck. Black can't develop the rest of his king side, and already the center is opened up. White can slam d4 onto the board. If this comes out, this is actually quite a thematic idea. You'll see this in some lines. This is very, very nasty. And this kind of positional sacrifice to give up a pawn in order to delay the development of an entire flank can be among the most dangerous that you can find in general. So bishop g4, no, I think bishop h5 was an inaccuracy. I should have taken and gone e6. In this case, I should have taken. Okay. But what if black just ignores the pawn again? Well, if you ignore the pawn again, then the move knight e5, and maybe I should, but knight e5 seems to come with even greater effect than before. This is just as unpleasant whether or not you take on e6. Okay, so d4, e6, and at this point things start to deteriorate for him. I think that this is the last moment. Yeah, bishop e4 is correct, actually. That is correct. So I just wanted to show that after bishop e4, if he goes knight takes e4, d takes e4, his position collapses. Because after bishop takes c6, we can do something really, really cool. Black is winning in this position. What should we take the bishop with, and what is the idea of that capture? Yeah, very nice bread first. Queen takes c6. We notice the x-ray, the standoff with the rook. After the knight moves, we have the move e3, winning the game on the spot, because the rook is lost. So that's why I always advocate for you to observe these standoffs. Like when you see two pieces, queen and a rook on the same diagonal, stuff like that needs to be noticed, because it can lead unexpectedly to these kinds of tactics. Okay, so queen e3, cd. He went back. I mean, at this point, the situation is dire. What he should have tried is this, and then this. And the point of this is that if we just take the knight, thinking, well, he can't take my pawn because it's defended, but first white takes the queen, then he takes the pawn and he forks the rook. And so black has to be very, very precise here in this position in order not to avoid getting, checkmated. Literally, white is threatening checkmate. But black can play a6. After bishop a4, black can play b5 and shut down this bishop, and then black is up in exchange. So this line was more complicated than it looked. I saw a6 in my head, so I relied on this. But this kind of stuff needed to be calculated. After queen e2, the game is over. If we just take this knight and then take that knight, white loses all of his pieces. So that was that game. Definitely more stuff to discuss in the Karo-Khan, and we'll discuss a lot of it because that'll be probably my main opening, for the next 100, 200 points. Okay? All right, guys, we'll call it a night. I'll see you guys tomorrow.